I want to thank you, and I want to thank Pastor Steve for having me this morning. And it's going to be a little bit larger than just talking about Azerbaijan, because we want to give a little bit of backdrop on what the Lord's doing around the world. Before we get into that, I'd like to introduce my family, the better 83.3% of my family. There it is. So I have one wife, 4 kids. We used to live in a country where we lived across the street from a guy that had 4 wives and 1 kid, so I need to make that clear. Oldest son is at UC Santa Barbara. I have 3 kids in high school, so when the worship leader talks about being tired, sometimes I'm tired, but not this morning. So I'm excited this morning. 25 years ago, my wife and I were on staff with Cru leading the ministry at Cal Poly, and it was about 30 budding students at the time, so they had to send us off into exile to really get the ministry going at Cal Poly. Now there's about 1,200 students involved, so it's a good thing they got us out of the way. So my wife and I, while we were at Cal Poly, a speaker from the U.S. Center for World Missions came up, and he showed us this picture. And he said that 95% of the people in the world that have not heard about Jesus still live in this part of the world. It's called the 1040 window, 10 degrees north to 40 degrees north latitude. And 95% of everybody on the planet that hasn't heard about Jesus live in this window. And similar to you guys, I was looking at your purpose statement to impact the community and the world with the life-changing message of Jesus Christ. I thought, that's what my life's all about too, so why don't I go to the place where nobody's had a chance to hear. So back in 1994, my wife and I moved to a country called Kyrgyzstan, which is right on the border of China above Afghanistan, and we started working with students in Kyrgyzstan. And the students in Kyrgyzstan actually the people in Kyrgyzstan were nomadic people and mostly shamanistic. So if you can imagine Native Americans and very aware of a spiritual world, and all those spirits are connected with something in nature. And so they had a little bit of Islam on the top of this deeper level of shamanism. And so everybody's names were Moonbeam or Sunbeam or High Mountain Meadow, things like that. So it was really fun to meet students and find out what their names were. And when we moved there was about 400 believers in the country. And they were wide open for the gospel. And so we stayed there 10 years, and when we left, in conjunction with lots of other groups that were working there were 25,000 believers in the country. And so we were able to pass off the ministry to local leaders, and then my wife and I decided, we'll just stay another season in Central Asia, and we moved to Azerbaijan. And Azerbaijan didn't look quite like Kyrgyzstan did. They weren't nomadic. They were living in large cities, and they were urban. And Azerbaijan had the fastest growing economy of any country in the world for 5 years running during the years we lived there, which meant lots and lots of money from oil, about $100 million a day coming in from oil revenue. And so you didn't have any infrastructure to the city, but you had everybody driving around in Bentleys as the open sewage is running down the streets. And it was kind of a crazy maker, because as everybody was chasing dollars, they weren't chasing after Jesus anymore. And so it's much slower going ministry-wise. And it may be a little hard to imagine. Most of these places I'm talking about, nobody's ever heard of before. And it may be better to show you a video of kind of what it looks like over there than me just explain. So I'm going to show you a little video of what Central Asia looks like. Oh, sorry. So this is, let me back up just a second here. In 2012, after we left Azerbaijan, my wife and I were challenged with the task of overseeing 10 countries in the Muslim world. And so now my wife and I oversee 50 teams of local ministers that work throughout this part of the world with Cru. And to show you a little bit about what Central Asia looks like, let me show you a video. So there you have it. Yeah. Woo. Yay, God. So, I'm aware enough to know that I am the embodiment of your average churchgoer's worst nightmare. Not just the hair, but the idea that if you keep saying yes to God, you're going to end up living in a yurt, eating sheep eyeballs, and separated from everything that's good in life. And so just to put everybody at ease, I'm not going to do a hard sell on making you sell your home and move out of your comfort zone and move overseas anywhere. So we're just going to talk about God's purposes for the world, and then there'll be kind of a soft sell at the end. So just so you know what you're in for this morning. How did I get involved in this? I grew up in a non-Christian family and became a believer somewhere in high school. And then when I got to college, I thought maybe I should read the Bible for myself. So I cracked open the New Testament, and right at the beginning of the New Testament is a book called Matthew. And, I thought, I'm a follower of Jesus, so I'm going to try and do everything that Jesus asked me to do. So I just started going through the book of Matthew and writing down every time Jesus asked us to do something. And so I came up with a list of 128 things in the book of Matthew that God asked us to do. And it turns out that the last one was Matthew 28:19. He says, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." And I thought, that's great. This is number 128 on the list. So if I get through the first 127, then, maybe I'll work on this going to all the nations. And it put me at ease a little bit because I wasn't even making it through the first 10, much less ever getting to 128. Well, as I started to become a little more of a student of the Bible, it got worse. So I came across Luke 24:45 through 47, which says, Jesus has already died, he's risen from the dead, he's walking alongside two of his disciples that don't really recognize who he is just yet. And so this is during the 40 days that he's alive on earth after he's risen from the dead. And he says to them, then he opened their mind to understand the scriptures. He told them, this is what is written. The Messiah will suffer and rise from the dead on the third day, and repentance for the forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name to all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. So I'm not sure exactly how this happened. He was doing, an hour-long Bible study with them, and slowly their minds were opened to understand what the Old Testament was about, because there weren't any New Testaments floating around at this time. So when Jesus opens their minds to understand the scriptures, he's talking about the Old Testament. And then Jesus kind of summarizes the Old Testament for them. And he says it's all about Jesus, that he's going to live and die and suffer and rise from the dead. And it's all about getting the gospel out to all the nations. So the scary thing is that Jesus summarizes the entire Bible by saying it's about Jesus and it's about taking the gospel to the nations. And this kind of elevated this command number 128 in my mind to think, this isn't just the last thing on the list. Maybe this is the most important thing on the list, and that's why Jesus saved it till last. So, do we have any kids here that are usually in Sunday school? You want to raise your hand? Do you wish you were in Sunday school right now? You don't have to answer that. Do you guys ever take tests in Sunday school? That's good. Because 400 years ago, if you went to Sunday school, it was preparation to take a test. There's this thing called the Westminster Catechism, and it was a test of 107 questions. And everybody that went to Sunday school, that's all they did was study for the test. And if you wanted to keep coming to church, you had to pass the test. And the first question on the test was, what is the chief aim of man? Which we don't even know what that means. What it means is, what are we really here on earth for? And the answer is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. We glorify God by making Jesus look good. And Jesus says, I want you to make me look good in all the nations. And that is the main thing in the Bible. And I thought, if I'm really a follower of Jesus, I guess I got to take this thing seriously. So my wife and I packed up our 3 suitcases and we moved over to Central Asia in 1994. And the reason I moved there was because of the biblical command. The reason I stayed involved in missions is because God involved me in an adventure. When we moved into Kyrgyzstan, we were knocking on doors of dormitories, meeting with students, and then we'd gather a bunch of students, and every Thursday night we'd go into Lenin's museum, which had a little auditorium like this, and we'd gather about 100 students. We'd do some skits and games, and then we'd talk to them a little bit about Jesus and find out who was interested in knowing more. And one time I was up there in front speaking, and a guy walked in halfway through, and he sat down right in the front row, right in the middle, and I was looking right at him the whole time. I thought, oh, here's a new guy, So as soon as I stopped talking, I went down and I met him, and I said, hey, what's your name? And he said, my name's Baish. And I said, oh, Baish, what brought you to our meeting today? He goes, well, I was looking for a bathroom, and I walked in here, and I was right in front. I was too embarrassed to get up and leave, so I got to go find a bathroom right now. I said, okay, well, maybe I'll talk to you after you're done with the bathroom break. So I started talking to Baish, and he and I became friends, and we started meeting every week, and we were talking about Jesus, and he was telling me about Islam and his beliefs. His dad was an Islamic leader, and he grew up in a very Islamic family, and we continued meeting, and one time we were sitting there having tea, and Baish says, do you think Jesus is coming back soon? Because even the Muslims believe that Jesus will be the last guy to come back at the end of time. So I showed him this verse from Matthew 24, and it says, this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, then the end will come. And I explained to Baish that over the first 1,900 years after Jesus, about 6,000 of the 12,000 people groups on earth had had a chance to hear the gospel, and that in the past 100 years, 5,500 of the remaining 6,000 have had a chance to hear the gospel. And so if you look at the exponential curve, it's going like this, and we've only got 500 left before this thing's fulfilled. So I said, I don't know exactly when Jesus is coming back, but I think he's coming back pretty soon. And Baish kind of hung his head. He was silent for a long time. I was uncomfortable. So I said, so Baish, you want to ask Jesus into your life right now? And he said, yeah, I do. And I said, well, do you want to pray right now? He said, no, I'll do it Tuesday. This was Friday. I'm like, what? Okay, well, let's meet Wednesday and see how it went on Tuesday. So we get from, I'm waiting from Friday all the way till the next Wednesday, to see what happens with Baish. And turns out that Tuesday was Qurban Eid, which is a huge Muslim holiday of sacrifice. And everybody in the dormitories all left for the center of the square where they have a big Muslim worship service, for lack of a better term. And Baish was alone in the dormitory. And when we met on Wednesday, he goes, I needed to be alone because I have so many sins that when I confessed my sins, I knew I was going to cry. And I didn't want to see anybody in the dormitory to see me cry. So I knew I had to wait till Tuesday when everybody was out of the dorm for me to confess my sins and ask Jesus into my life. So I was doing high fives with Baish, and we were rejoicing. I said, it's so awesome to see another Kyrgyz brother come into the kingdom. And Baish says, I'm not Kyrgyz. And I said, well, are you Uzbek? Because I knew he grew up down on the border of Uzbekistan. He said, no, I'm not Uzbek. He said, I'm Kopchak. Like I'm supposed to know what that means. And he said, I'm like, well, what is a Kopchak? He said the Kopchaks were a people group that was the biggest people group in Central Asia during the time of Genghis Khan. And when Genghis Khan came through, some of them assimilated with Genghis Khan, and he drove the rest of them out to the border of Hungary. And now we live in a Kopchak village in Uzbekistan where we have our own culture and our own language and everything. And I thought to myself, what if that same Friday to Wednesday when I was waiting for Baish to receive the Lord, Jesus was in heaven getting ready to come back because the Kapchaks were the last people group on the planet that he's waiting to fulfill this verse, and then the end will come. I thought, wouldn't that be awesome if I could have played a role in helping fulfill the Great Commission? And wouldn't it be even awesomer if I had a front row in heaven because I was the guy that finished the game for everybody. And everybody would be walking around heaven saying, oh, there's the guy that finished it off for us. Hey, yeah, high five, woo. I'd be like this hero guy. And then I thought, what an awesome privilege to be involved in God's greatest plan for all of history. Just by saying yes. Another reason I'm involved in missions is because there is fulfillment. Blaise Pascal said that everybody does everything they do for their own personal happiness. And there is this type of happiness in being involved in God's plan that far exceeds any other happiness I've experienced here on this planet. And so for purely selfish motives, I continue to be involved in the Great Commission. When we were living in Central Asia, we started a home group. In addition to the student ministry we were running, we thought, hey, we might as well reach our neighbors while we're at it. So we moved into the middle of this block with all these other people, and we started inviting people to our house for a home church. And so we had about 10 neighbors that would come every Wednesday for a home church. And one of those neighbors' name was Aigulia, which just so happens to mean moonflower. So Moonflower had a couple kids. She was a single mom who had 2 kids. Ibec was her son, and then her daughter, Elvira, was 6 with cerebral palsy. And they lived at the end of our street. And one day she came and said, hey, we're really freezing at our house. You know, it's so good to be here at your home group because we're freezing in our house and because our heater stopped working. And so one of the guys was much more mechanical than I was in our home group, and so he and I went down the next day to Aigulia's house, if you could call it that. Basically, it was a shed, no windows, no anything, and it had this big boiler in the middle of it that would kind of heat the whole house, and the whole thing was clogged with soot and stuff like that, so it wasn't working anymore. And when she did light up anything, it would just fill the whole house with smoke. So Yura and I cleaned out her chimney. And when I saw how she was living, I found out also that she would go to work every morning at 6 and stay until 6 at night. And when she left, she'd put a padlock on the outside of the door to keep her kids safe inside. So Ibec and Elvira would sit in one chair, no Game Boys, no video games, no TV, no nothing, 12 hours a day, sitting in a chair, waiting for their mom to get home. So I thought, what can we do for this family? And in the former Soviet Union, they don't celebrate Christmas. You know, that got wiped away as the opium for the masses. And so they celebrated New Year's with a Christmas tree and everything. They just replaced it and made it non-religious. So we were still used to Christmas on the 25th, so we'd celebrate Christmas on the 25th. And I thought, well, what if we took all our Christmas stuff over to their house on the New Year day? You know, we could still have Christmas, and then we'll just take all our Christmas, we'll buy them new presents and everything, and take it over to their house on New Year's Day. It was a great idea until New Year's Eve came. And then, you know, it was snowing, it was cold outside, and I had just made this great cup of decaf, and I was sitting down in my chair, and my wife reminded me, hey, you know, I think we promised to go take our Christmas stuff over to these people's house. And they didn't even know we were coming. I'm like, they don't even know, you know, it's no big deal, and this coffee's really good, and I'm kind of tired, and it's snowing outside. And my wife, who's much more spiritual than I, said, get off your butt, and let's go. And so I take this Christmas tree, I got needles sticking in my head. Back when I used to have hair, you know, there was needles in my hair, ornaments dingling down the street. We're walking down the street, you know, everybody's like, what are you doing? And, you know, it's knee-deep snow. We're dragging 4 kids along. They're all complaining and hating life or whatever. And so we get to the door, we knock, and we bring in this stuff, and Aigulia's eyes are just huge. And Elvira, the one in the wheelchair with cerebral palsy, her eyes are just huge, and she's got this huge grin on her face. And Ibeck, the son, has this scowl on his face. And so I'm like, okay, whatever, maybe he wanted a different color present or something. So we set up this Christmas tree, we plug in the lights. They have one outlet in their whole house. We had to bring an extension cord to plug in the lights, And then we set up the presents, and this whole time Ibeck's got this scowl on his face. And I said, Iguli, what's wrong with Ibeck? Oh, he's okay. He just can't really believe what's happening. And I said, why is that? He said, because this morning he woke up and he asked me, why has God forgotten about us? And she said, why do you ask? He said, because I'm 10 years old and I've never gotten a present in my life. And all the other kids get presents on New Year's, and I've never gotten a present in my life. I think God's forgotten about us. And she said, well, let's pray that by some miracle, God would give you a present this new year. I don't have any money to buy you a present, but maybe God can get you a present this new year. And 25 years later, I'm telling the story, whereas if I stayed home drinking my coffee, I wouldn't be remembering that evening. Because God includes us in plans that he already has in motion. And it's the most fulfilling thing on the planet to be involved in what he's doing. Another reason I remain involved in missions is because of the need. In Matthew chapter 9, it says, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field. About a year and a half ago, a business friend of mine went to a conference called Finishing the Task, and it turns out that there's only 440 people groups left on the planet that have not heard the gospel yet. And so the guy that owns the Manse on Marsh, named Chris, he came to me and said, hey, I just went to this conference. There's only 442 people groups. Let's knock one off the list. You got some contacts in some of these places. So we went through that list, and we looked at it, and we identified one people group that I thought maybe I have some contacts that could help with this place. And just so happens, back in the time of Esther, the people of Israel were in exile in Persia. And it says that there were people dispersed all throughout Persia. And turns out there were some Jews back in that time that never got the memo to return back to Jerusalem. So there's still pockets of Jews living in the mountains in Persia that have 2,500 years plus of Jewish history, but since that time have become Muslim, but still have Jewish stars on their gates. They still go to synagogue and are identifying both with the Jewish religion and with the Muslim religion. And there's this group called the Tots that have never had the chance to hear the gospel. And I thought, well, it usually doesn't work like this, just throwing some money at a project and seeing what happens. But I got a contact with a guy that we used to work with that showed the Jesus film throughout Azerbaijan. Let me give him a call. So I called Ilgar, and I said, Ilgar, this is going to sound really crazy, but we got a business guy here in California that wants to try and reach the Tots. Have you ever heard of them? And he says, yeah, actually, I'm half Tot. And I speak the Tot language, and I got relatives up in this village that could help us possibly reach the Tots. So Chris Skiff, with his winning personality, gets a church like Harvest Church involved, and you guys have helped Ilgar put together 4 different ministry teams over the past year and a half. And through their efforts, they've seen 65 Tots trust the Lord and 5 new home churches started. Okay, just to give you some perspective on this, I lived 24/7 in Azerbaijan for 5 years, and we only saw 15 people trust the Lord during that entire time. So through your participation with Ilgar, we've seen 5 times as much happen in a year and a half as we were able to see with a team of 22 people happen in 5 years. The point is, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. There are people waiting out there to hear the gospel so they can respond and come to know the Lord Jesus. They're not fighting us. They're not hating us. They're waiting for us to tell them about Jesus because they're living in darkness and they need the light. And the need is real. Blaise Pascal, great mathematician, great theologian, said that through prayer, God gives us the honor of causality. In other words, through prayer, God allows us to cause stuff to happen. He doesn't need our help necessarily, but he's including us. He's inviting us to join him in his great work. And through that, we get to cause stuff to happen. God made it very clear to me a while back that he doesn't need my help. I was teaching this English class on superstitions, and I asked a bunch of students, how do you know if something's real? And they said, if I have a dream about it, it's real. And I kind of laughed it off and said, okay, next person with a better answer. Next guy raises his hand, if I have a dream about it, it's real. 17 Kyrgyz in the room said, yes, if we have a dream about it, it's real. I thought God could reach this place overnight without my help. All he needs to do is give everybody a dream. But God chooses to include us. So I want to challenge you today. Here's a picture of some tots. Sorry, I got carried away. Forgot about the slides. It's interesting to me that Jesus didn't walk up to Jerusalem, feel compassion on it, and say, the harvest is plentiful, the workers are few, now go get out there and do it. He said, the harvest is plentiful, the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest. He wants us to be involved in prayer, not because God is unwilling to save the lost, but because we need time to get our hearts aligned to where God's heart is already at. He wants us to come to him in prayer so that our heart would match up with his to be involved in all the nations. God does want us to be involved in helping reach all the nations through giving as well. I'm not a huge dog lover, but we did have a dog growing up, and we had a dog living overseas. And we had this beautiful German Shepherd, super smart. We'd keep him in a cage when people would come in, although she could easily jump over the 8-foot fence if need be. And we'd let her out in the yard during nighttime to protect the place. And in Central Asia, they don't have dog food, surprisingly enough. You know, they don't sell any dog food. How crazy is that? So we would just give the dog leftovers. And this dog had plenty of energy and lived a long, healthy life. So when I moved back to the United States, it almost like if somebody leaves the tap on around here and just lets water run, that same feeling for me when I would throw away leftovers and then go out to the store and buy dog food. As Christians, we spend 8 times as much in America on dog food as we give to missions. Recently, I was doing a word study on foolishness in Greek, and the word foolishness in Greek literally means a lack of perspective. It could be, no, I'm not bashing on dog lovers and on dog food industry. I'm just saying it could be we have a little bit of a lack of perspective on what's really important. And so my encouragement is, if reaching all the nations is the most important thing to God, maybe it needs to be reflected in his people through the things that we give our money to as well. The soft sell at the end is to challenge you to go. Part of that lack of perspective, we have a lack of perspective because we only see one thing, and that's okay. But God may want to expand that. And Curtis Henry is going to come join us in our part of the world in one of our 10 countries we oversee for a couple months this coming year. We're trying to encourage teams from Harvest to come for 1 week to see what is God doing in the rest of the world, so that he can increase our perspective and diminish our foolishness and allow us to be players, to be satisfied players, to be fulfilled players in this great historic plan he has to reach all the nations. Come join me in helping fulfill the greatest plan that God has ever given to mankind.